Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. The death toll from these past 2 weeks of violence in Lebanon now exceeds 1,000. The Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati says as many as 1 million people have been displaced. Israel continues to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon this Monday, including one deadly strike on a Sunni-majority area in the heart of Beirut. We'll be asking, does an Israeli ground invasion look like an inevitability now? Well, Hezbollah says it is ready for an Israeli ground invasion. The group says it will soon be announcing a new leader who will be replacing Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed on Friday. Welcome. More than 60 people have been killed in Israeli attacks across Lebanon since last night, including 3 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Well, the Lebanese Health Ministry reports that the death toll from an Israeli raid on the southern town of Ain al-Delb, which is east of Sidon, has now risen to 45. At least 75 others are injured. Additionally, the ministry confirmed that 12 people were killed and 20 others injured in an Israeli raid on the town of Bekaa, on a town in Bekaa, I should say, on Sunday night. Well, a Lebanese army soldier was killed in an Israeli attack which targeted a motorcycle he was riding through an army checkpoint close to the border. This marks the first soldier casualty reported since Israel began extensive bombing in Lebanon last week. Well, Israel's defense minister hinted today at a potential ground offensive in Lebanon.
We'll do what needs to be done. Our aim is to return residents of northern Israel to their homes. To return the residents of the north to their homes, we will be ready to make every effort. This is your mission. This is the IDF mission, and that's what we'll do. And we'll employ all of our capabilities, including your forces and other forces, from the air, the sea, and the ground.
Meanwhile, Hezbollah's deputy chief, Naim Qassem, says that the group is prepared for a long conflict following on from the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. Lebanon's acting Prime Minister Najib Mikati said that the government is prepared to fully implement the 2006 UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which aimed to end Hezbollah's armed presence south of the Litani River as part of a ceasefire agreement with Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's foreign minister has indicated that a ceasefire will not be considered unless Hezbollah disarms.
Hezbollah will continue with its goals and their presence in the field. The Islamic resistance will continue to confront the Israeli enemy in support of Gaza and Palestine, in defense of Lebanon and its people, and in response to assassinations and the killing of civilians. We will face any possible attack, and we are ready. If the Israelis decide to enter by land, the resistance forces are ready for a ground engagement. We have prepared and got ready, and with our trust in God Almighty, we are confident that the Israeli enemy will not achieve its goals, and we will emerge victorious from this battle.
Naim Qassem of Hezbollah speaking there. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a 3-minute video message today, which he said was aimed to address the people of Iran. Well, in this message, which comes 2 days after the killing of the Hezbollah leader, which, of course, Hezbollah is backed by Iran, Netanyahu said that nowhere in the region was beyond Israel's reach. He also said that, and I quote, Iran will be free a lot sooner than many people think.
There is nowhere in the Middle East Israel cannot reach. There's nowhere we will not go to protect our people and protect our country. With every passing moment, the regime is bringing you, the noble Persian people, closer to the abyss. Iran's tyrants don't care about your future, but you do. When Iran is finally free, and that moment will come a lot sooner than people think, everything will be different.
That was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu there. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said earlier today that the world is a safer place after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. Blinken described the late leader of Hezbollah as, and I quote, a brutal terrorist. And he once again insisted that diplomacy is the best chance for peace in the Middle East. Well, for more reaction, I'm joined now by the former US National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster. Thank you so much for speaking to us, General McMaster. Can I just start by asking you whether you agree with what Antony Blinken said with regards to Hassan Nasrallah?
Absolutely. I mean, he's a brutal terrorist who has so much blood on his hands, not only American and Israeli blood, but Lebanese blood. I mean, I think this is an opportunity for the Lebanese people to be freed from Hezbollah. But we have to remember what happened to the Syrian people and how Hezbollah provided the shock troops that helped the Assad regime kill, wound, or displace half of the Syrian population. So I think this should be a happy day, not only associated with the death of Nasrallah, but so many of his top lieutenants, about 20 of the top leadership have been eliminated as well. And of course, while this is in the context of Israel attempting to get its population back into the northern parts of Israel, it will have important ramifications, as you know, Tom, across the region.
General, we're hearing as well that the United States is set to send a few thousand extra troops to the Middle East. That news is hot off the press. I'm just wondering what you think those extra troops will be doing there.
Well, I think it's to deter and, if necessary, to impose costs on Iran or to prevent Iranian responses and attacks. I think what we're beginning to see, Tom, is that Iran is actually quite weak. And Iran only appears strong when we try to de-escalate all the time with Iran. Iran, I think, is happy to expend every Arab life, every Lebanese or Palestinian life in pursuit of its twin aims to push the United States out of the region as the precursor for destroying Israel and killing all the Jews. And for those of us, and I think many of your audience, want an enduring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But you can't get there if you have empowered terrorist organizations who are committed to the destruction of Israel. That doesn't sound like a two-state solution to me, Tom. So I also look at the degree to which as many resources have been diverted, away from the Lebanese people by Hezbollah. There's reputation of being a social services organization. But as we know, I mean, they're really a mafia organized crime network that's one of the largest drug trafficking organizations in the world. It's a human trafficking organization that enslaves women who they have captured in Syria, for example. The same thing with Hamas. I mean, I just think it's a missed opportunity. I wish that there was a television special, on the lifestyles of the rich and famous Hamas leaders with quick cuts to film of the destitute Palestinian population in Gaza. So I think it's time for all of us to advocate for an end to these terrorist organizations and to empower the people of Lebanon, the Shia population in Lebanon, and certainly the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank.
The situation in the region is developing extremely fast. I mean, faster than I think many of us could possibly have predicted. The last couple of weeks have been extraordinary. I've got so many things I want to ask you, but let me just ask you this. Benjamin Netanyahu said today, and I quote, "Iran will be free a lot sooner than many people think." He said that in that 3-minute message that he recorded and addressed to the Iranian people. I don't know if you had a chance to see that, but what do you think he means by Iran will be free a lot sooner than people think?
Well, I think he's speaking on the anniversary of the murder of Mahsa Amini by the police. And the continuing repression of the Iranian people. Remember, in the recent protests in Iran, some of the chants that you would hear is America's not the problem. The problem is right here. And I think there's a growing recognition that this theocratic dictatorship that is perpetuating these fitnas across the region and continuing to support, these terrorist and militia organizations that lie outside of government's control. And of course, I'm talking about Hezbollah, which is the model, but also the proxy army that Iran is assembling in Syria, or the Hashd-e-Shaabi militias in Iraq, or the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, look at the human suffering they're perpetuating. The Houthis get press because they attack shipping, but they're starving children to death. in Yemen with their in besieged communities there. So I think it's time for the world and for the Iranian, including the Iranian people, to say enough of this. This theocratic dictatorship that has enriched itself, with these bunyads, which are these sort of conglomerates that are staffed mainly by the children of the corrupt clerical order in Iran, are denying the Iranian people the great promise of what should be a very wealthy and a very prosperous country. So I think the time is now for the Iranian people to let their voice be heard. I mean, they don't. America, no other country is going to liberate the Iranian people. It's going to be their decision. And there's a lot against them, right? With the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, with the Basij and other tools of repression that the Iranian regime has in place. But we can only hope, right? We should hope that the Iranian people gain the strength, have the strength to really affect a change in the nature of that regime that has caused so much pain, so much suffering inside of Iran, but as you know, across the Middle East, Tom.
General McMaster, with regards to the situation on the border between Lebanon and Israel, is your prediction that a ground invasion by Israel is now an inevitability?
I think it is, Tom. I think it's inevitable, because you have 60 to 80,000 people displaced, where we saw the horrible attacks, the continued rocket attacks across the border, killing children in soccer fields. And of course, there are terrible civilian casualties in Lebanon as well. I think that really what has to happen here is a ground offensive, because actually, paradoxically, Tom, people don't really understand this, I think, is that a ground offensive will be a lot easier to discriminate between civilians and the Hezbollah infrastructure and Hezbollah terrorists. So I think a ground offensive is not only necessary, but is preferable to these strikes, which, of course, Hezbollah positions its rockets underneath people's houses. The bunker in which Nasrallah was killed was 3 stories under the ground at the bottom of an apartment complex. So these are people who use civilians as human shields. The only way to really discriminate without excessive civilian casualties, which everybody hates to see, is through ground force, I think.
And just lastly, General McMaster, you were, of course, U.S. National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump, who's got a reputation of being something of a deal maker. Were he to win back office, what are your thoughts? Would he be able to calm the situation, assuming that it hasn't already been calmed by then?
Well, I think he's been tough on Iran, right? Of course, he's been inconsistent on Iran after the Soleimani killing. There was a reluctance to respond to Iranian retaliation on the attack on the Al-Assad air base, the shoot down of a drone, the attack on the Saudi oil facilities, Aramco oil facilities. So he hasn't been completely consistent. But what he used to tell me all the time, Tom, is everywhere I look in the Middle East, everywhere there's a problem in the Middle East, Iran's behind it. So he understands what the return address is for all the violence and hardship in the region, and the return address goes right back to the mullahs and the RGC in Tehran.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us, U.S. National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster. Thank you very much indeed.
Hassan Nasrallah was a brutal terrorist whose many victims included Americans, Israelis, civilians in Lebanon, civilians in Syria, and many others as well. During his leadership of Hezbollah, the group terrorized people across the region and prevented Lebanon from fully moving forward as a country. Lebanon, the region, the world are safer without him.
Now, every day for the past few days, people have been moving from the south of Lebanon and from the southern suburbs of Beirut to areas of the country and areas of Beirut that are deemed to be safer. Well, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, and the Lebanese Prime Minister says the actual number of displaced could be around 1 million. Well, schools and hotels are filled with people seeking safety, and for those less fortunate, they're having to sleep on the streets. Well, the few flights that are operating out of Lebanon are all full. These 2 people fled to Spain.
Yesterday they bombed Beirut. They bombed Beirut in the heart of Beirut, next to my aunt's building. Every day you have to wake up, make sure your friends, your family are okay. You tend to worry about a lot of things, but I wish nobody lives what we are living.
I'm relieved, but I'm so worried about who we left behind. We are so worried. It's not over yet. It just began.
Okay, well, let's get the latest from Lebanon, and we can speak to the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, who's based in Beirut. Gareth, Browne, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I just want to start by asking you, do people there feel like a ground invasion by the Israelis is increasingly likely?
I think they do. I think it's a very, very dynamic situation. And had you asked me, just a few weeks ago, I think people here in Lebanon were quite complacent, and they didn't necessarily think that the war was going to expand. They assumed that Israel was not interested in an all-out war, in a comprehensive war, in a ground invasion. And that's all changed, I think, in the last 2 weeks or so. We've seen this Israeli decimation, frankly, of Hezbollah's senior military command and its political leadership, which obviously sort of reached that crescendo in the killing of Hassan Nasrallah on Friday. But I think even in the last few hours, this spectre of the prospect of a ground invasion has started to feel a lot more imminent, a lot more urgent, a lot more real. And I think the Lebanese from all over the country now are sort of despondent about the fact that this is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
And just talking about what's been happening there today, there was an area of Beirut that was attacked today, the area of Kola, which is a Sunni majority area. It doesn't seem to have an obvious Hezbollah presence. I'm just wondering, what's the significance of that target and other places that have been struck during the last 24 hours?
I think the strike on Kola is very significant. I mean, it represents a broadening, a deepening, a widening of the war. Hitherto all of the strikes in Beirut had been in the Dahia, in these southern suburbs, where we know Hezbollah has traditionally had substantial support, substantial presence. They keep their weapons there. They keep there's bunkers under that part of the city. Kola is an intersection. It's where you go if you want to take the bus or the shared taxi to the north, or even to Syria. There's also a lot of Lebanon's migrant workers live there, Sri Lankans, Filipinos. And so, it was a very different place for them to attack. Now, Israel says it killed 3 PFLP Palestinian militants. And I think it's indicative. Israel is widening this war. Hezbollah is not the only target. It's going to take out any target it thinks it can get in that country, whether it's Hamas, fighters from other Palestinian groups, other Lebanese groups who decide that they're going to fight any ground incursion. The list of targets is widening. We're seeing Israel target everywhere. It's not just in the south anymore. It's in the Bekaa Valley. There's been airstrikes to the north of Beirut. The war grows by the day, by the hour.
Indeed. And we heard from the deputy of Hezbollah today, Naim Qassem, who talked about patience and urged the Lebanese public to be patient. I mean, that's a really big ask, isn't it? I mean, how is the Lebanese public sort of reacting? Are there signs of fractures? Is there any finger pointing? Or do people remain as united as they looked and sounded, let's say, a week or so ago?
No, I think in the early days of that mass displacement from the south, you saw solidarity, and I think you're seeing that start to fracture already. Anecdotally, I can tell you stories of people in the Christian parts of the city not wanting the Shia from the south or from Dahia to stay in their apartments or in their neighborhoods because they're worried that they might be targeted by Israel. And I think that is one of the most worrying things. Okay, this country is really on a knife edge. Hezbollah has been weakened dramatically, more than any Lebanese could possibly have imagined a few weeks ago. It's probably the weakest it's ever been as an actor for 20 or 30 years. Now, that presents opportunities for the Israeli state, perhaps for the Lebanese state and perhaps the Lebanese army to reclaim some of its authority, perhaps even expand some of its abilities. But it also means that there's something of a vacuum. And I think a big concern is that as this dust settles, it's okay, hospitality and friendliness and taking in these people from the south, it lasts. But if this is going to go on for weeks and weeks, months and months, then there's always a risk of sectarian tensions. And we all know, Lebanon's depressing and brutal history when it comes to these sectarian tensions, that civil war, which lasted 15 years, fought largely along sectarian lines. So I think people are worried. And the longer this goes on, the more tension builds, not just between the Lebanese and the Israelis, but within Lebanese communities themselves.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Gareth Browne, Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Thank you. Well, let's cross to Tel Aviv and we can speak to our correspondent, Trent Murray, who is standing by for us. Trent, the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot has been visiting Beirut today. France is, of course, a close ally of both Lebanon and Israel. And we heard the French Foreign Minister calling on Israel for a ceasefire again. But that's not looking likely at all, is it? And if anything, it looks like we're headed for another escalation and as we were just hearing there, a ground invasion.
Yeah, well, Tom, that certainly seems to be the way the trend lines are suggesting that they're tracking. I mean, certainly based on some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, both out of Israel, but also, of course, out of Lebanon. Both sides are really ratcheting up the rhetoric and the threats rather than trying to dial down the tension. Certainly, I think the visit today by the French Foreign Minister, as well as some of the telephone calls that we know have been taking place from Washington and other places, have been trying to get both sides to de-escalate. But what we're seeing up on the border here in Israel is they are continuing to amass their tanks and troops up on the border. Yoav Gallant, the defence minister here, visited some of those troops today, saying the next phase in Israel's war with Hezbollah was coming, quote, soon. And of course, we're hearing this reporting now out of the Washington Post in the US, which is telling us that Israel has informed the United States that a ground operation is coming and it's imminent. So certainly the signals would suggest that something is afoot there. We have seen in the past sort of 30 minutes or so as well a statement by the IDF posted on social media saying the commander of the Northern Force troops has approved operations and plans for any sort of incursion that might occur. So it sort of seems going into this evening that both the tension is ratcheting up, the rhetoric is ratcheting up, and just the facts on the ground based on we know that Israel is amassing troops and tanks up there. The facts on the ground suggest that certainly something seems to be in the works, which is why we know diplomats, as I say, are really just trying to bring both sides back from the brink here.
OK, and we heard earlier in the day Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu giving that address to the Iranian people. What was the main thrust of that message, do you think?
Well, look, it was a very unusual message, really, from the Israeli Prime Minister directed at the people of Iran. He effectively sent a message saying that Israel's disagreements is not with the people of Israel, but is with what he described as the regime in Tehran. And he said that people will be free in Iran a lot sooner than they think, which, many interpret that as suggesting they were encouraging some sort of regime change almost in Tehran. And he said effectively that there was no place in the Middle East that Israel could not reach, again suggesting that if it wanted to, Israel could strike deep within Iranian territory. So again, not just on the northern front with Hezbollah, but also with Iran, it seems the rhetoric coming out of Tel Aviv right now is one of ratcheting up the threats, ratcheting up the rhetoric, and suggesting that further military action is coming. It was an unusual message out of Tel Aviv today, directed at Tehran and also the people of Iran more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the situation's moving so fast. I mean, even as you've been speaking, we've heard EU member states saying they want an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council. We've got the UN chief just saying now, one of his spokespeople saying he's absolutely against a ground invasion of Lebanon. And Trent, just going back to events closer to where you are now in Tel Aviv, Hezbollah claimed to have used a so-called Nur missile, that I believe is a ballistic missile, in one of its attacks on Israel today. Just tell us a little bit about that attack, what's been happening on the ground in Israel today, and how significant it is that Hezbollah should have used this type of missile.
Well, look, I mean, what it suggests, I think, is that Israel Hezbollah is trying to send a message, perhaps, to Israel that despite these 12 days of heavy bombardments targeting what it says are some of its rocket and missile storage facilities, that they do still possess the capability to fire off some of these ballistic missiles. Some estimates suggest that they have had an arsenal of around 40,000 of them that can travel between 160 and 300 kilometres. Well, considering that Tel Aviv, where I am, is only 150 kilometres from the Lebanese border, I just think it's a reminder of that enormous show of force that Hezbollah does still potentially have the ability to show here. I mean, there have been some discussions in Israel and media reports around just what percentage Israel has managed to take out of Hezbollah's missile arsenal. But I think really there is an understanding even here that despite these 12 days of operations, which they're quite buoyant about, that there are still a very large number of ballistic missiles that could not only overwhelm the Iron Dome system if they were fired in great number, but they could also then cause significant damage, and not just on the border communities up near the Lebanon border, but as you know, far down here as Tel Aviv. So look, again, a pretty strong show of force by Hezbollah. There's also some suggestions when you're up in Lebanon. I was there last month. Is that quite often Hezbollah will fire rockets and drones and missiles to test the Israeli defence array, to potentially try and find some weak spots in it. So was this ballistic operation part of those types of tests? We just don't know. But again, firing ballistic missiles into Israel just does the opposite of trying to dial down the tensions. And I think we've seen, obviously, Israel launch its own airstrikes again today on Beirut. And so these concerns just continuing to simmer around where all of this could lead.
OK, thank you so much. We're out of time. Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, thank you very much indeed. We've been talking here about what is a broadening conflict which stretches from the Palestinian territories to Lebanon, and which has also drawn in Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Yemen. Well, today, Yemen's Houthis said that they plan to escalate their operations against Israel. This announcement comes the day after an Israeli attack on the Houthis there in Yemen, which the group says killed 5 people and left more than 50 others injured. Well, the Israeli attack came the day after the Houthis said they'd targeted Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport with a missile at the very moment that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was flying back from New York. Well, for more, I'm joined by the former US ambassador to Yemen. You served under President Barack Obama, and you were also Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Gerald Michael Feierstein. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. It sounds, listening to the rhetoric, the latest rhetoric from the Houthis, that they're taking things up a level.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And yes, I think that the Houthis, unlike Hamas, unlike Hezbollah, aren't close to Israel. And presumably the Israelis don't have the same degree of intelligence about the Houthis that they have about those other organizations. So right now, the Houthis are probably feeling pretty secure. The Israelis hit Hodeidah again. This is the second time that they've targeted Hodeidah. But to be entirely honest, the Houthis won't be moved by any damage to Hodeidah. That's not something that is of great interest to them. So they perhaps see themselves, with everything that's happened with Hamas and Hezbollah, that they are the last man standing, if you will.
Yeah, and they don't seem to be at all deterred by the fact that the head of a much larger, arguably much more powerful organization, namely Hezbollah, was killed only 4 days ago.
No, I think that they probably don't. I suspect that they're probably taking some precautions to protect Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the head of their organization. But again, I suspect that they're feeling as though the Israelis cannot target them as effectively as they targeted the Hamas or Hezbollah leadership.
Help our viewers and me understand this. Why is Iran supporting the Houthis? What's their goal?
Well, it's a good question, and we really saw it begin to change during the Arab Spring and around 2012, 2013. The Iranians had initially, earlier, been pretty hands-off with the Houthis, but they began to switch and provide greater training, provide greater material support for the Houthis. A few things may have motivated them. There may have been, of course, some ideological or sectarian interests that they had, but probably more significant is that the Iranians might have seen the Houthi ability to interdict shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb as potentially an additional layer of deterrence for Iran in the case that either the U.S. or Israel decided to target them, with the idea that the Houthis' ability to shut down shipping in that vital waterway would be something that might come in handy at some particular point. And of course, what we've seen over the last 9 or 10 months has in fact been a demonstration of that effect. The Houthis have been reasonably successful, at least in restricting shipping, if not stopping it completely.
Another question I wanted to ask you. The U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, says the U.S. is currently extremely concerned that Russia might supply anti-ship missiles to the Houthis in Yemen. I want to ask for your thoughts on that. Why would the Russians do such a thing?
Well, it would be crazy, of course, for them to do it. The analysis, the assumption would be that the Russians might be tempted to do that in some way as a strike back for U.S. and Western support for the Ukrainians in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that this would be a way to distract international attention from what's happening in that theater of war. But of course, it would risk alienating key Russian allies or partners in the region, particularly the Saudis, the Emiratis, even the Egyptians, who would understandably be upset if the Russians helped the Houthis increase the military pressure on shipping in the Red Sea.
And just lastly, you were one of the people who spoke out against a decision by the Trump administration to designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization. At the time, it was considered a risky move. Some even call it pure diplomatic vandalism. Why were you so sure that was a mistake?
Well, I think that a number of former colleagues, U.S. diplomatic colleagues, as well as the international humanitarian community and the UN, saw that broad designation as a foreign terrorist organization as something that was going to affect innocent Yemeni civilians much more than it was going to affect the Houthis. And it was going to make it impossible, really, for international humanitarian groups to continue providing the essential assistance, food, medicine, other kinds of assistance that they were providing to the Yemeni people. And so when the Biden administration decided that they had no choice but to impose new sanctions on the Houthis, they tried to tailor it much more closely so that the vast majority of Yemenis were not damaged by the designation, and they've stuck to that since then.
And all the while, the people of Yemen are continuing to suffer, aren't they? And the Houthis' actions are making the prospect of a return to a peaceful life for the average Yemeni person an ever more distant prospect, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, I think that with everything else that's happening in the region and the world right now, we've lost sight of the fact that the humanitarian situation in Yemen continues to be extremely concerning, with a majority of Yemenis who are either malnourished or suffering from food insecurity, as well as the collapse of other kinds of vital social services, education, health, these other services. And even though there's been a ceasefire in place for about 2.5 years now, fighting does still go on, and innocent Yemenis are still being killed or harmed by fighting between the two parties. So the war in Yemen is not over. Even though we don't read about it very much anymore, it's still there. It's still concerning. We still have millions of Yemenis who are living under threat.
So, Ambassador, here we are with the Houthis as defiant as ever. They say they're going to carry on with their attacks on ships in the Red Sea. I mean, how much of a threat, broadly speaking, do the Houthis pose to the region?
Well, it's a very good question. And of course, they've demonstrated, I think, over these past number of months that their capabilities are far greater than anyone had understood prior to that, and that they have been effective, and they continue to increase their effectiveness in attacking international shipping in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Aden. And of course, they continue to pose a threat to their neighbors, particularly to Saudi Arabia, even though there have been negotiations and a ceasefire in place. So the Houthis have proven over these past, we're now, of course, observing, this is almost 10 years since the civil war started in Yemen. We have seen the Yemenis improve their capacity, improve their capabilities, and they are a major military force in the region right now.
My last question to you doesn't specifically concern Yemen. It does, however, concern US diplomacy. We're just hearing from the US State Department a message. It says the US still supports a ceasefire in Lebanon, but at the same time, military pressure can at times enable diplomacy. As a former US ambassador, I'd like to ask whether you agree with that.
Well, it's certainly true as long as you have a very clear understanding of what your desired goal is and how military pressure is going to support achieving that goal. Military pressure in and of itself without a clear end game doesn't generally accomplish very much. So you need both sides of that equation. You need a clear political end state that you're trying to achieve, with an understanding of what exactly are the steps that you're going to take to achieve that. And that's the big question right now. We understand and we can see on a daily basis what the Israeli military operations are accomplishing. But it's not at all clear that the Israelis have a very clear end state in mind, or whether the end state that they're seeking is actually realistic and achievable. And that's where the Israelis run the risk of incurring a great deal of damage, not only to their neighbors, but to themselves, without accomplishing very much in exchange.
Okay, well, we're out of time. It's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. The former US ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Michael Feierstein. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Before we leave you, let's get a reminder of our top stories. The death toll from these past 2 weeks of violence in Lebanon now exceeds 1,000. The Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati says that as many as 1 million people have been displaced. Israel is continuing to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon this Monday, including one strike which hit a Sunni majority area right in the heart of Beirut. This, as observers say, that an Israeli ground invasion looks increasingly likely. And Hezbollah says it is ready for an Israeli ground invasion. The group says it can be announcing a new leader to replace Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed on Friday. Well, that is all we have time for. Up next, Hadley Gamble will be here. She's interviewing Russia's Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak. And at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. Amongst other guests will be the former FBI Director, James Comey. That's it from us. Thanks for watching.